Welcome to the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. This is a regular podcast where we'll look at the history of the First World War and travel together across the battlefields from Ypres to the Somme and beyond. So what's in this week's episode? Hi, and welcome back. This week to the 10th episode of the Old Front Line. Thanks once more for all your comments on social media. I really appreciate that. And thanks for your likes on Apple Podcasts and your reviews. Do continue to do that, it really helps. This week we return to our Forgotten Battlefields series, and we're on the ground at Loos. This has always been a part of the Western Front that has interested me, and I was lucky to get a chance to walk it once more just before the lockdown at the beginning of this year with fellow battlefield guides Tim Thurlow and Mark Allen. It's an area that will also feature in my forthcoming book for pen and sword, Walking the Forgotten Front, which will look at that sector of the British part of the Western Fronts between Armentières and this area here around Loos. But for now, we get ready to make our walk, we strap on our boots, we get our pack, and we head off onto the Old Front Line. This week, we return to one of the forgotten battlefields of the First World War, the battlefields of Loos. The Battle of Loos was fought in northern France on the 25th of September 1915, and the fighting continued until the 13th of October with a major assault on the German positions around the Hohenzollern Redoubt, one of the key German defensive positions on the battlefield, which had been an objective since the very beginning. It was the first big push of the Great War from a British perspective. Many of the accounts at the time called it that. Patrick McGill, one of the veterans of the London Irish Rifles, wrote a book called The Big Push, and it was the first time that a large number of men from Kitchener's army, the Volunteers of 1914, largely men of the first 100,000 men to have joined as volunteers into the new army in August and September of 1914, went into battle. This was their blooding, if you like, on the Western Front, although the first Kitchener battalions had actually seen action at Gallipoli in August of 1915. The assault took place on a front extending from the village of Givenchy in the north, just on the other side of the Le Basset Canal, across the flat, open coalfields around villages like Auchillet-le-Basset, Vermelles, Hulloch, down to the ground around the village of Luz-en-Goël itself, just north of Lens. I'll put a map on the website so you can see what the battlefield of Loos looked like. It was in many respects a featureless battlefield. Big open fields, rising ground, most of which was held by the Germans, devoid of any cover. There's a few copses here and there, some buildings from the mining operations, small little villages like Loos, but pretty much nothing to disguise any big movement of troops. And this would play a factor in the battle there in September and October of 1915, when units attacked over this open ground, often in broad daylight, and suffered horrendous casualties as a consequence of it. Although there was some success at Loos, it was a battle that largely failed. The Germans were of course pushed back in certain areas, ground was gained, in some cases giving us a more favourable position on the battlefield. But it was a battle that cost tens of thousands of casualties, and the failure to break through as part of the assault, it was a joint offensive with the French. As the British attacked at Loos, the French attacked in two other parts of the Western Front as well, at Notre-Dame-de-Lorette and Vimy Ridge, in the ground between those two locations further down in northern France, and in eastern France in the Champagne near Reims, there was a big assault by the French army in that sector as the Battle of Loos took place amongst the coalfields of Hulloch and Lens. But one of the key outcomes of the Battle of Loos in 1915 was a change in command of the British Expeditionary Force. Sir John French, who had led the BEF from the very beginning of the war, was undone by this battle. Promise of breakthrough, promise of success resulted only in heavy losses and resulted in him being sent home. and being replaced by Sir Douglas Haig, who commanded the British Expeditionary Force for the remainder of the war. So in that respect, Loos was an important turning point. It witnessed too the British Army fighting its biggest battle of the war in terms of resources and men that were available. There was no restriction of artillery at Loos. In the earlier battles of 1915, during the so-called shell scandal, when shells had almost been rationed on the battlefield, artillery had not been able to do its job. But at Loos, there was no excuse for the failure of artillery because there was a huge amount of shells available for the guns. But Loos exposed a weakness in the way the British Army fought its battles on the Western Front. And perhaps that's the subject of a podcast of its own. But the key issue was communications at Loos. It exposed that weakness of many First World War battlefields, and that it was being fought in the 20th century way, but with 19th century communications. The inability of commanders to see where their men were, understand what they were doing, and control those men on the ground resulted in heavy senior officer losses. Several divisional commanders became casualties at Loos, and with their loss, it also saw a loss of control on the battlefield, and the failure to move up sufficient resources, sufficient reserves to the right place at the right time meant that when there was some success, it was not exploited. And this approach would really dog the British Army for a significant part of the First World War until they learned properly how to cope with it, properly fight modern battles, which they achieved in the final year of the war in 1918. But let's move on from tactics to the battlefields, and we're going to start our walk outside the Rutoire Farm, close to the village of Vermelles. Le Rutoire Farm was the name given to a series of farm buildings out in the open fields here beyond the village of Vermelles. It was ground captured by the French in the earlier battles of 1915. And when we took over the sector, the farm became advanced brigade headquarters for the units that were in the line here. During the Battle of Loos itself, on the first day, the 2nd Infantry Brigade of the 1st Division had their headquarters here, and it was an important signalling post to signal back messages, relay information from this part of the battlefield. The farm was largely destroyed by 1918. By some miracle, parts of the original farm building still do survive, and when you stand here in front of the farm and look at the gable ends of some of these buildings, you can see the old building style of using red brick and white stone to create a layered effect, giving a clear indication that this is a pre-war, not a post-war construction. The original cellars also exist beneath this farm. Back on the 90th anniversary of the Battle of Loos, I was able to get into these cellars. The farmer was very friendly here, and he opened up the cellars as part of the commemorations that year. Later on in the conflicts, round about 1916 I would guess, an observation bunker was added to this farm complex, and that survives here today. So from starting outside the farm, we're going to go to our right slightly, and as the road bends, we'll take a track off to our left, and we'll follow that track until we reach a farm gate on the edge of the farm complex. And looking over this gate, we'll see that bunker within the grounds of the farm itself. Now, this is private property, and you should never enter unless someone is about to give you permission to do so. The bunker was built by the Royal Engineers as probably a forward observation post for the gunners, for the artillery, to be able to observe the enemy positions beyond Loos and bring down artillery fire to support the infantry on the ground there. It has a large underground complex beneath it. On the times that I've been able to go up to it and into it, you can see access to that. And it's also a dumping ground today for the farmer to put munitions before they're subsequently collected and taken off for safe disposal. Another good reason to not go poking around, because there is this ordnance from the Great War still in there, which even after a century has the capacity still to kill people. In fact, people are killed and injured each year on these Great War battlefields by fiddling around, messing around, trying to defuse munitions and ordnance from the conflicts. Mainly collectors, very few farmers, I'm pleased to say, are injured, but it does happen. So whatever you see on these battlefields, take your photographs, don't pick it up, and certainly don't attempt to bring it home. But from the farm we'll walk further down the track to where the trees border the edge of the paddock on that edge of the farm complex, and we'll stop just beyond the last few trees and we'll look across this landscape. Standing here, it really brings home just how open this landscape is around Loos. If we followed this track, it would take us eventually to the village of Loos itself. Just to the right of where we are now, this was the dividing line between the two divisions. The 1st Division, whose battle we're going to look at later on in this walk, and to our right, the 15th Scottish Division. They were Kitchener's army, a new army division formed as part of the first 100,000 volunteers in 1914, and this was their first time in action. The division was commanded at Loos by Major General McCracken. He was a regular soldier who'd been a brigade commander at the beginning of the war and had been wounded at the Battle of Le Cateau in August 1914. Unlike him, the vast majority of his men were civilian soldiers, men who had not seen previous military service before the war. The very epitome of what men in the new army were all about. At 6:30 a.m. on the 25th of September 1915, 0 hour for the first day of the Battle of Loos, 6 battalions from this division made their attack across the ground you can see from where you're standing. At the other end of this track was the village of Loos, which was part of their objective. But before they got there were 2 German defensive positions, redoubts. The Loos Road redoubt on this track, and the Lens Road redoubt, which was just on the main road that ran from Bethune to Lens, which you can easily see by looking to your right and noticing the busy build-up of traffic along the main road there, and also the large structure of Dud Corner Cemetery and the Loos Memorial, which is very close to the site of the Lens Road redoubt. Beyond that, you can see a twin-peaked slag heap, a coal mountain, and that's on the site of the double crassier that existed at the time of the First World War. That was behind the German lines. Loos is invisible from here. It's concealed in the dip beyond this low ridge, and it is a low ridge. And when you look at the maps, you see it's the Germans who are in possession of this low ridge, in possession of this rising ground that gave them dominance on this part of the battlefield. So when those 6 battalions went into the attack, they were supported by their guns. The artillery had done not a bad job here. They were also supported on the ground by the Royal Engineers. Men from the 91st Field Company Royal Engineers, for example, went forward as combat engineers in this attack to clear the obstacles, to clear the way and help the men secure the positions once they were captured. Smoke and gas were used by the British to suppress the German defenders of this ground, who were from the 157th Regiment of Infantry. The smoke proved effective, but some men got lost in it and suddenly found themselves running parallel to the German trenches. The attack here was successful, although some men got hung up on the German wire and had to cut their way through it. And it was here that one of several brave deeds on the 25th of September 1915 resulted in the award of the Victoria Cross, in this case to Piper Laidlaw of the 7th Battalion King's Own Scottish Borderers. Daniel Laidlaw was born in 1875 at Little Swinton near Berwick-on-Tweed. He'd been a regular soldier before the war and had served in India with the Durham Light Infantry, later transferring to the King's Own Scottish Borderers as a piper. He was a reservist when the war broke out and re-enlisted and was posted to the 7th Battalion, part of the new army. Experienced men like him were very useful in helping to train these new battalions. His citation for the Victoria Cross from the London Gazette details what happened that day. For most conspicuous bravery during the worst of the bombardment when the attack was about to commence, Piper Laidlaw, seeing that his company was somewhat shaken from the effects of gas, with absolute coolness and disregard of danger, mounted the parapet, marched up and down and played his company out of the trench. The effect of his splendid example was immediate, and the company dashed out to the assault. Piper Laidlaw continued playing his pipes until he was wounded. The tune he was playing was the Blue Bonnets Over the Border, and one account of him said, "Piper Laidlaw, the Piper of Loos, stands as a type of a class of men who throughout the war have lived up to the traditions of a great past." Despite his wounds, Laidlaw survived the Battle of Loos and survived the First World War. He would play his pipes again many times after the war, but there were two occasions that were particularly notable when he played those pipes for the cinema. The first was in 1929 with the film The Guns of Loos, and then again in 1934 for a film called Forgotten Men, which nearly 20 years after the guns went silent exposed how the nation had forgotten somehow the veterans of the Great War. In that film, Piper Laidlaw marched up and down again once more, playing the pipes in the way that he did on the fields of Loos, these fields, in 1915. Doubling back on ourselves, we returned to the farm and turned right, walking past the Rutoire and continuing beyond the farm area towards the Vermelles-Hullock road. But before we get there, we take a track that goes off to the right, and we walk a little way along here and then stop. Having moved round to the other side of Rutoire Farm, we've now come into the sector of the battlefield where the 1st Division attacked on the 25th of September 1915, the first day of the Battle of Loos. This was a unit that had been in France since the very beginning of the war. It had taken part in the retreat from Mons, the fighting on the Aisne, the First Battle of Ypres, and in some of the British offensives of early 1915. But by Loos, its ranks were now swelled with many wartime volunteers, men of the new army, who had been trained in England and sent out as replacements for these battalions of the regular army. On attachment to the division were a number of territorial and new army battalions, the 9th King's Liverpool Regiment and the 14th London Regiment, the London Scottish being the territorials, and the 8th Royal Berkshire Regiment and the 10th Gloucestershire Regiment from the new army. All of these units, alongside their regular counterparts, would participate in the attack here in the opening stage of the Battle of Loos. Standing here, again we can see that this is a flat, featureless battlefield. It's a massive area of open ground, and the track stretches off ahead of us towards a single tree we can see, and more of that later on in the walk. But if you look carefully, particularly if you drop down slightly, you'll see that the ground rises gently to a ridge line, the Grenay Ridge, and the German positions here were on the reverse slope of that ridge, and that meant they couldn't be seen from the British front line, and nor could they directly see the British trenches from their positions. So they had dug trenches forward up over that Grenay Ridge to give them the observation that they needed, and these were the northern and southern sap. A sap is a trench that moves forward from the main defensive line, whether it be British or German. Gas was used here, as on every part of the British line in the Battle of Loos, but the winds changed direction in the lead up to 0 hour, which was 6:30 in the morning on the 25th of September, and caused a lot of casualties to the units in the front line. The 1st Battalion, the Law North Lancashire Regiment, and the 2nd King's Royal Rifle Corps both suffered around 200 casualties from this gas. And when the wind changed direction again, this time favourable for the release of poison gas, it was used once more. But the attacking troops in the assembly trenches had to come up out of those trenches and shelter behind them to avoid getting gassed again. So this first use of gas by the British on the Western Front in the Great War was not always successful. The assault went in. The artillery had done some damage to the German trenches, but the defenders had survived and inflicted heavy losses on the assault battalions, and the open nature of this ground meant that the fields of fire of machine guns and the destruction that they could cause was immense. And the heavy losses sustained in that initial assault meant that the reserves had to come up to continue with the battle. Close to where we're standing now was the so-called Green's Force. Green was an officer of the Royal Sussex Regiment in charge of the London Scottish and the 9th King's Liverpool Regiment, and together they moved up to continue with the attack on the Grenay Ridge. The 9th King's Liverpool Regiment was led into action by their commanding officer, who was quite conspicuous on the battlefield as he carried a large walking stick. But his men moved up, and the machine guns from the battalion opened fire and enabled the men to move forward, and the Germans in the positions ahead of them surrendered. The battalion history noted that a harvest of souvenirs was reaped by the men, many of whom secured the coveted Pickelhaube helmet. Some years ago, while walking this part of the battlefield, I found the parts of one of the ornate Pickelhaube badges that went on the top of the helmet, a fragment of one Pickelhaube that perhaps the men of the 9th Kings forgot to pick up on that first day of the Battle of Loos. But to get more of a perspective of the battlefield here, we'll continue down this track and walk to that lone tree we can see standing in the fields here. The original lone tree was a cherry tree that sat in the middle of no man's land on this part of the battlefield. When the British took over here, the tree was already in bloom, and my old veteran pal Harry Coates, who was here with the London Scottish, remembered seeing birds sitting in its shattered branches. He also recalled the skylarks here, and whenever I've walked this part of the battlefield, at almost any time of year, the larks are there, somehow connecting me back to Harry's stories of this ground in 1915. Harry Coates went into battle here for the very first time on the 25th of September 1915 as an infantry soldier in a rifle section, and his best mate, whose name he would never repeat because of the agony it caused him when he remembered, was killed alongside him very close to where this tree is now. Against orders, Harry stopped and knelt alongside the body of his friend, seeing if he was killed or just wounded, and he saw his cold, dead eyes staring out through the eyepieces of the gas mask that they were wearing, and knew that his mate was gone. Harry moved forward into the attack, but was gassed himself, the masks somehow not functioning properly, and that gas got him out of the trenches for some months before he returned in time to take part in the operations on the Somme in 1916. And his story of that part of the war is featured in a previous Old Frontline podcast. Because the shattered stump of this tree, a tree marked on all of the British maps of this area, was the only feature that any of the soldiers who fought here could really see, it took on great importance to them. And another soldier of the London Scottish souvenired a whole cross-section of the tree as a little wooden disc, and that was taken back to regimental headquarters, where it's still in the museum of the London Scottish even today. The tree was replanted after the war, but was later lost. When I first came here, there was no sign of any tree. But in the 1980s, a group of Great War enthusiasts from Bristol and the Forest of Dean decided to replant it in memory of all of those who had fought here in 1915, but in particular the men of the 10th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, which was special to many of those who were active in getting this tree restored. And every year on the anniversary of the battle, a little ceremony of remembrance is held here to remember those who stepped forward on this open ground beneath the Grenay Ridge in the Big Push. We'll now continue with our walk down this track, and it'll take us up onto the very crest of the Grenay Ridge. To our right, when we meet the next track, we'll see the village of Loos sitting in the hollow, and beyond that, Hill 70 and the outskirts of Lens. But we'll turn left here and walk down a little way, where we'll see 2 battlefield cemeteries, and we'll visit those. North of the lone tree were 2 little copses that sat in no man's land, both of which had German trenches coming into them to afford them a good clear view of any attackers that came in the direction of the main German line. The southern one was called the Bois Carré, the square wood, and the other one just La Haye. No trace of these woods, these little copses, survive now, but the cemeteries are both very close to where they were. The first cemetery is indeed named after them. This is Bois Carré Cemetery. To access it, we take a little grass path across the field. It's got a very big flint wall and entranceway. And as we walk in, the first thing that strikes us is the irregular nature of the graves that are here. These are not necessarily neat rows. There are staggered graves at different angles, and quite a few special memorials as well to men known to be buried here, but the precise location of their grave is not known. And this is typical with a frontline burial cemetery or a cemetery made on the battlefield, and that's exactly what this is. The cemetery was made in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Loos in September of 1915. This was ground over which men from the 10th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, recruited in Bristol, and the 8th Battalion of the Royal Berkshire Regiment, recruited in Reading, attacked in that opening phase of the battle. And indeed there are several headstones of Royal Berkshire officers here. Their story is featured recently in an absolutely fantastic book by Andrew Tatham called A Group Photograph. He inherited this group photograph of the officers of the 8th Royal Berkshires, and he's researched in incredible detail the story behind the men in that photograph, tracking relatives and descendants of these men and building up an unparalleled history, really, of a group of officers from one battalion. It's a book that's still in print and is highly recommended. And when you come to this cemetery, you can go to the pages in the book and read about the story of the Berkshire officers who are buried here. After the Battle of Loos, this cemetery remained in use. It was close to the new British front line, which was now on the other side of the Grenay Ridge, nearer to the village of Hullock. And in the spring of 1916, battalions from the 16th Irish Division held this sector of the line in their first few months on the Western Front. The burials here reflect that, with a large number of graves of men from the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and the Royal Irish Rifles. And amongst the Dublins, the Dubs, are men who were attached to one of the tunnelling companies of the Royal Engineers, because once this new line was established, there was a lot of mining activity there, tunnelling underneath the battlefield. So when we look at some of the graves from the Royal Dublin Fusiliers from April 1916, these are not men killed in the trenches, these are not men killed holding the line. These are men killed in the war underground, their bodies retrieved from the tunnels and brought back here for burial. Leaving the cemetery, we return via the grass path, walk along the track and then take another path to the next cemetery. This is 9th Avenue Cemetery. It's another battlefield cemetery, a small one, and when you go in you see that the majority of the burials here are in one collective plot. It is essentially a form of mass grave. It was named after the 9th Avenue communication trench that ran through this area, and the bulk of the burials are from the 1st Battalion Cameron Highlanders, all killed in the opening phase of the Battle of Loos between the 25th and the 29th of September 1915. That battalion lost 17 officers and 369 men during this period. It broke through the German lines after the attack of the Royal Berks and the Gloucesters, and it's said the patrols from the battalion got into the nearby village of Hullock, finding it deserted. It makes a interesting speculation of what if that success had been exploited, but it wasn't, and the line held. After the fighting was over, the survivors of the Cameron Highlanders cleared the battlefield of their dead and brought them back here for a burial. They dug a series of trenches, and it is said that the men were laid in those trenches on their sides with their arms over the shoulder of the man next to them, comrades in death. And it's with that poignant thought in mind that we leave the cemetery, return along the grass path, continue to the track to where it meets the main road, and here turn left and walk along to the much larger cemetery we can see before us. This is St Mary's ADS Cemetery. An ADS was an advanced dressing station, a medical facility on or near the battlefield. And when we look around us, we see the open nature of this ground, something we've seen during the entire walk. And it can't be possible that any form of medical post could have been above ground here. So this must have been an underground dressing station. There was no cemetery here during the war, no original burials. This is a cemetery made from isolated graves and smaller cemeteries on the Loos Battlefield that were closed and moved in here in the early 1920s. There are nearly 1,800 burials here, and of them, nearly 1,600, the vast majority, are unknown. The identity of the soldiers could not be ascertained after the war when their bodies were found and moved here. So it means that there are very, very few known soldiers buried in this cemetery. When we walk amongst the rows, we see that in some cases there are partial identifications, a rank, a regiment, a date of death or burial, but that's it, nothing more to give a clue as to who that soldier was. And amongst the graves that are here for many, many decades, there was a grave of an unknown lieutenant of the Irish Guards. And in the 1990s, research by a Canadian historian, Norm Christie, identified him as Lieutenant John Kipling, the son of Rudyard Kipling, the author. Now there is much debate about this grave. Is it John Kipling? What we know is that Rudyard Kipling, his father, spent a huge amount of time and effort trying to uncover what had happened to, as he called it, my boy Jack. He wrote the Irish Guards' regimental history for the Great War, so he had access to their records. He spoke to survivors from the Battle of Loos. He employed a private detective to look into what had happened to his son, but nothing could be ascertained. Post-war, the body of John Kipling could not be found, could not be identified, and he was added to the Irish Guards panel of the Loos Memorial. When that was unveiled, Rudyard Kipling paid for a local Frenchman to come up to the Loos Memorial and play the last posts at sunset every evening, and that continued until his death in the 1930s. So when you think of all the work that Kipling did to try and uncover what had happened to his son, how did he miss this grave? Did he miss it? Did they find it in the 20s? And did they discount it for some reason? There's no record of it in the Kipling papers, as I understand it. And partly the identification of this grave as John Kipling revolves around the misidentification of a map reference, or the misreading of a map reference, because the map sheets, the trench map sheets for this sector, changed later in the war. And which of those map sheets were the reburial parties using when they cleared the battlefield in the 1920s and found this unknown officer of the Irish Guards? We'll never know. And John Kipling is not just commemorated here, his name is still listed on the Loos Memorial. And I think that really, like so many stories of the Great War, this is a tale that is as yet unfinished. But it draws many visitors to this cemetery, a cemetery which is, in many respects, a legacy of the death of this officer, because Rudyard Kipling threw himself into the work of the then Imperial War Graves Commission, and he helped shape the design and the focus and the ethos of the cemeteries as we see them today. Broken by his son's death, he later wrote in one of his poems, "If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied." The weight of responsibility for his son's death, Kipling felt that perhaps he pushed him too hard to join. He was a boy whose eyesight was poor and had been rejected for military service, but giving Rudyard Kipling's connections, he was able to secure him a commission in the army. And those thoughts, and no doubt many more, created a huge amount of guilt. Survivors' guilt, just like the soldiers who came back, was just not restricted to the men who served in the front line. The families had to deal with the consequences of the losses that you see around you as you look amongst the rows and rows of graves in this cemetery. And it's that we ponder on as we bring this walk around this sector of the Loos Battlefield to a close. It's that part of the podcast where we look at an object connected to the First World War. And once again this week, it's a postcard, just a simple postcard, not even of a soldier, it's of a young girl. I bought this many years ago when I lived in Reading. There used to be a great little junk shop that I used to go into there. And looking through one of the boxes of postcards one day, I saw this, or rather the inscription that's on it, and it reads, "Returned from France after Battle of Loos, September the 25th, 1915. And I brought it home with me. It's from a photographer in Oxford Street in Reading, and it almost certainly belonged to a soldier of the Royal Berkshire Regiment who fought in the ground over which we've walked during this week's podcast. And I think of it fluttering in the wind on the battlefield, and another soldier coming along, seeing a picture of this little girl, perhaps having a child at home himself and couldn't bear just to leave it there. And he picked it up and he sent it home and hoped that someone in Reading would claim it. Whether they ever did or who this young girl was, I'll probably never know. But it's an incredible connection to the events that day, and it makes you think, who was this girl's father? What happened to him on the 25th of September for him to lose this card? Did he return? And it's the power of simple objects like this to link us back to the Great War. And I'll put a picture of this up on the podcast website. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or other podcast services. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. Follow me on Twitter at Somcor, and have a look at the podcast website www.oldfrontline.co.uk. I'll see you next week on the battlefields of the Great War.